Hey, hi, hey everyone. Welcome back for those of you who joined us before, and welcome to anyone else who is joining us for the first time. This is the Ask the Expert series from Exploring the Link, Cannabis and Psychosis, where we talk about all things cannabis and psychosis. And today we have a lived experience panel for Through Our Eyes, and we all, including me, have lived experience with cannabis and psychosis. So my name is Elias. I'm the kind of moderator today, and I'm part of the Youth Advisory Council for the Cannabis and Psychosis Project. Heath, do you want to go next?
I could take it off from there. My name's Heath. I use they them pronouns. I am also a person with lived experience in cannabis and psychosis, which occurred during my adolescence in high school when I was 17. I currently work in mental health advocacy and drug policy reform and sit on the board of Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And that's a bit about me.
Awesome. Thanks. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. And I also have lived experience with psychosis and cannabis. My first experience with, or my first encounter, or my first episode with psychosis was in my mid-20s. I'm now in my late 20s, so not too long ago. I currently work for a tech company that focuses on healthcare and healthy active living. So it's been a really nice space for me to kind of promote strong mental health kind of initiatives and the like. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Want to round us off, Harrison?
Totally. So I'm Harrison. I'm from Toronto, Ontario, but I'm currently in Squamish, BC, which is why I still have the sun beaming into my eyes here through the window. And yeah, I also have lived experience with cannabis and psychosis, and that happened in 2014 when I was in my last year of high school, and I'm now 23 years old.
Perfect. Thanks. So to tell all the people who might not be familiar, so this Ask the Expert series is here so that we can answer all of your questions. So we're all here. We'll be here for about an hour, answering all the questions we can about cannabis and psychosis and speaking through our lived experience lenses. To start us off, we have a question from our last round, part one. So what are the methods and motivations for young people to use cannabis, and what do you think the main motivation is for young people who use cannabis, and how are they using it nowadays? Anyone want to start us off with that?
I can speak to it.
Perfect.
I would love to speak to this because I think the methods and motivations are big pieces of like cannabis harm reduction, particularly around youth. Like obviously it's like if they're using, that's like one piece, but why they're using and how they're using are like really like what you want to get to. I know for me personally, like a lot of my motivations for using cannabis were like socializing. I was like a neurodiverse queer young person in a small town who was kind of weird and eccentric. So people just already assumed I was on drugs all the time when I wasn't. So I think honestly, I was more comfortable having like the weed use be kind of a scapegoat for my eccentricities because it made it more funny or palatable for people, I guess. And being that like stoner, like the identity around substance use, I think is big too. People struggle with identity, and it's a way to make friends, and it's a way you can kind of define yourself. People would like, if I was at a party, people would be like, "You have a bong," and suddenly I had a new friend. So I think that that's like a pretty big piece. But then the motivations changed over time too, and then it became a lot more coping. And then I was just like smoking weed to feel better about stuff, especially because I was a depressed and anxious teenager. So if I was crying in the bathroom over lunch and came back with red eyes, I could just be like, haha, yeah, I'm so high, haha, and not like address other things going on in my life. And that's, I guess, like the motivations part. As for methods, I mean, like we definitely smoked a lot and did a lot of edibles growing up, but I think with like the new classes of cannabis products, I think that youth aren't smoking as much from what I've heard because they just know it's not healthy and they don't want to smell like it. It's less discreet too. So I feel like edibles and vaping are definitely more popular among young people than like smoking bong and like carrying a bong around or like smoking hash or something. But I remember talking to one teenager that I know, or someone who was a teenager at the time, and they were talking about how they would do dabs in their bedroom because their mom wouldn't smell it the same as if they were smoking, which kind of blew my mind because I was like, that's like just so much more potent, the THC in like a dab, than like smoking a joint. So it's as if like they're trying to be discreet, but also, and like maybe like mitigate some like lung health harms, but also exposing themselves to greater harms when it comes to like the concentration of products that they're using, like specifically THC concentration. So yeah, that's a bit about what I understand in terms of like methods and motivations for young people. I feel like the vaping piece is big, but I think edibles too. And also considering too that they'll probably continue either making their own edibles or accessing black market edibles, which are still readily available online, and not like Health Canada approved products, but just yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot to that, and like the idea of like the identity piece is really important. I think it often gets overlooked that like it does sometimes come with a whole identity, and the progression of that into like a way to cope and into like a different place on the spectrum of use as well is really important because it shows like how things can change with people's substance use over time. Mm-hmm. And for anyone watching who doesn't know what a dab is, it's a very potent concentrate of THC, so normally like 70+% THC versus the like 15 to 25% THC that's in the normal flower. Sarah Harrison, do you wanna jump off of anything there?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is very similar to what Heath described. For me, growing up like in high school, it was very much just a way to kind of like fit in with friends. My friends were experimenting, so I was like, well, why not? It wasn't like they shoved a joint in my hands, but they didn't necessarily, say no when I was like, let me try some. And then, as you grow older, for me, when I was using the most heavily was when I was working from home. And this was just a job that had me working from home. This was pre-pandemic days. But yeah, combination of boredom, loneliness, and it helped pass the time. Food tastes better. TV shows are funnier, more entertaining. But you kind of get into a cycle because for me, like when I was stoned, like I would sleep a lot. So my understanding of time and, all of a sudden it'd be a week and I barely left my bed. And that, of course, just kind of snowballed from there. I think with young people, their main motivation, I mean, there's a spectrum, but I think a lot of people, there's this misconception that cannabis, like smoking cannabis, is like healthy, like just healthy, and as opposed to smoking cigarettes. And yes, there are many more detriments to smoking cigarettes, but I wouldn't say cannabis is like the best alternative, at least not for everybody. And I think sometimes we fall into this area where you see like the potential health benefits of cannabis, of like CBD oils and stuff. And again, those do ring true for many, many things. But there is a certain limit. Every single person has their own threshold that they can that their body is able to withstand, and that often gets overlooked. And just with the ease of getting whether it's edibles or a vape or something like that, I think that also makes it easier for people to kind of engage and just do what they want with it.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the point that like cannabis does bring like help to a lot of people is important too, because it can be a good thing in people's lives, and that idea of a threshold is really important too, because it's kind of like the line where you cross where it becomes more problematic than helpful. And I think that like there was one thing that you said that really stood out to me, and it was the idea that like um sorry, my mind is just blanking right now. So I'm gonna reframe this as like if anyone has any
Can
questions for us, throw them in the comments.
Can I build off of that too? Actually, just I like what you said too about the boredom piece because I think that that's huge and that's a big part of like the prevention. It's like if kids are bored, they're gonna want to use drugs sometimes. Like not all kids. That's the other thing. But the motivations are going to be different for every young person. So I like that we're talking about our own experience because it's like it's different for everybody. And what you said about like I don't think you put it in this phrasing, but like the pleasure component, you know, that it makes food taste maybe better, or like it makes things funnier, like to a threshold, and then it's like suddenly every time you're eating, it's cold because you have to smoke weed first, or like you can't decide what to watch because you're just burnt out all the time. But like, yeah, the pleasure component's huge, and I feel like it's often lacking, and specifically like when we're talking about young people and drugs, it's like if we're talking about adults and drugs, we still don't talk about the pleasure component of drug use much, but like especially with young people, like people don't want to acknowledge the fact that kids do drugs because sometimes it's fun and they enjoy it, but that's also a reality.
Yeah, and that was actually the thing that my mind couldn't remember, the idea of experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that like a certain amount of substance use in general is fairly normative, and like people go through phases and people try out different things, and trying pot isn't necessarily a bad thing for everyone, and some people again can have like positives from that. And it's the idea of a threshold, like when that becomes problematic, like how can you reevaluate that relationship? Harrison, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I did, and I think they're great points. Like cannabis has definitely like been known to be like this like pleasure, like people use it for pleasure, like a bit of escapism. Some of it's social, some of it like either like starts off one way and becomes coping. But I think like one of the big issues with like the question of what are the motivations for people smoking is that right now what I'm seeing in media is cannabis being marketed as a cure-all kind of thing, and not necessarily explicitly like this weed will do everything for you. It's more along the lines of like, you know, like you can go on websites like that'll run through every single strain that exists allegedly and like give you all the effects and side effects and benefits and whatever, but like it's all weed at the end at the end of the day. It's all cannabis. So yeah, I just think it's a problematic component that we have to be aware of, that like it's now like a vehicle of like profit, and people are going to max out on the coping aspect, which is just like, yeah, like sure, if you find relief from cannabis in some manner, I think that's something you should be aware of and like approach with caution and investigate, you know, through asking yourself questions actively. And the second thing I wanted to just touch on, like just in kind of response to what a few of you have been talking about, was with the boredom piece. It like kind of, there's this cure to boredom, and unfortunately through what I've seen, like kids don't get bored anymore, and bored is it's a more fleeting feeling. Like internet addiction is on the rise, and like because of it, like whenever we feel like even a lingering like sentiment of boredom, like the first thing you do is just grab your phone and distract yourself. It's something we've learned to escape and never feel if we want to. And so sure, like not hanging out with your phone is fine, but like if you find yourself wanting a joint too, that's the same problem.
I think that brings up a couple of really good points. And like first off, the what you were talking about, the idea that it's become something that people promote as being like very positive, but then you also have the opposite side where people say it's like completely negative, and you have the two different sides kind of like clashing, and the point in the middle where like the truth lies, where like it does have some positives and it does have some negatives, is often missed, and that nuance becomes harder to find. And I like the idea of like boredom being something to tolerate too, and not to just like run away from it, but just to kind of like be able to sit with it and find out how to deal with it.
Dare I say, like learn to embrace it. Like it's one of the beautiful things in life is letting your impulse and imagination carry you through parts of your day. If you're clinging to your phone to get to the next task, there's no harm in that. And like there's purpose in like having checklists and all that stuff to like, for me, that's very helpful in my work day. But when I'm done like my academics for the day, I pack it in and say, okay, like I'm just gonna like hang with my housemates, see where, you know, if we want to go to the river today, or if we want to like throw the frisbee outside, like let ourselves be bored and then ask ourselves how we're going to solve it creatively.
Very well put. Thank you. And I want to remind everyone watching that if you do have any questions, throw them in the comments and we'll do our best to answer them, because that's what we're all here for today, to be able to answer any questions that you guys have about cannabis, psychosis, and lived experience with them. So we have a question here from Kira, and it's a very long one. First off, love Keith's inside shirt. Yeah. And then makes me wonder what the panelists see as a relationship between psychosis, cannabis, and other drugs. Do you think people think of psychosis as having a link to other drugs? Are issues of stigma similar? How might harm reduction apply across the board? And no pressure to answer all of them, because there's a lot there. Does anyone want to start us off with that? Heath, since you're wearing the inside shirt, can I tap on you?
Yes. Kira name dropped me, so now I feel like I have to. For those watching, Insight is like the first supervised consumption site in the world, but also in Canada. Just like great harm reduction stuff. So I find it interesting the link, and I mean it's the whole Exploring the Link project. It's like very specific to cannabis and psychosis, but psychosis has been linked to other substances as well. They're like if you are on like a meth binge and you've been high on like amphetamines for a handful of days, psychosis is very common. Doing psychedelics, like the feeling of like psychedelics almost bring about like an induced psychosis that you're like signing onto because it produces hallucinations. It makes your neurons fire off very similarly to like as they would during a psychotic episode, but it's something you've consented to, so it's a very different yet still somewhat similar experience. Well, at least for me, because my psychosis was a lot of visual hallucinations. I know for others it's often more auditory and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, definitely psychosis has a link to many other drugs, but also like there's an underlying like link towards trauma too. Like psychosis is one component of the mental health and drugs kind of bidirectional relationship. I know trauma is huge there as well. And stigma, definitely similar, but different, because I mean, like, if you're using what may be societally considered hard drugs and you have psychosis, people are like, oh, snap, like, you did a bunch of acid and now you're, like, feel like your brain broke. Like, that's serious. But if you're smoking weed, I feel like people, at least when it happened to me, are more likely to be like, weed's a soft drug. Like, what? You can't handle your weed? Come on. Meanwhile, like, I've seen people have, I mean, I was the stoner in high school. I was the one people went to for weed. So I've seen people have terrible reactions with weed where they feel like they're losing their mind and having like the worst anxiety they've ever experienced. And then in terms of the harm reduction applying across the board, I mean, that's just meeting people where they're at, right? And acknowledging that not everyone is going to abstain from drug use, but rather than trying to stop people from using drugs, trying to mitigate substance-related harms is just much more achievable and realistic for a lot of people. So in a nutshell, I feel like I've touched on all of those things without diving too deeply into any of them. But yeah.
It's a big question, and I appreciate you bringing up all the different facets to it, like that there are relationships to psychosis with other drugs as well, and that like psychosis kind of lies at an intersection of a whole bunch of different things, and there's trauma, genetics, there's environmental factors like substance use and like stress, all of that sort of stuff, and it kind of comes together into a very unique situation for everyone where people may experience an episode of psychosis, and even then like how they experience that psychosis is different. And I like the point you made about like weed often being seen as a like softer drug, because it kind of like it invalidates a lot of the problems that some people have with cannabis, and which can be very real.
I think it also leads to people being a little reckless sometimes, particularly if they're doing like edibles or like a cannabis concentrate. It's like that can be like quite a psychedelic experience. So like you need to know what you're signing up for, even if you've smoked a joint in the 70s and you're doing like a cannabis concentrate edible now. It's going to be much different. But
Thanks. Did anyone, either Harrison or Sarah, want to jump on that, or?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I think people see the relationship between psychosis, cannabis, and other drugs. I think maybe on a more general level, all three things to a certain degree, they kind of like they change your perception of reality. So, and if I ever talk to someone about my drug-induced psychotic episode, and then I mentioned that, oh, leading up to it, I was smoking a lot of cannabis. There's like a level of like, oh, okay, like thank you for sharing. But there's also a split second where they were like, oh, like of course that happened. And I think when it comes to the stigma aspect, I think sometimes, or actually most of the time, psychosis kind of gets like the shorter end of the stick, like what Heath was saying about engaging with like psychedelics, for example. Like it is also in itself like changing your whole perception of reality, but you're engaging with it consensually. So like if you imagine you were talking to a friend and they were like, oh man, I just took 3 tabs of acid and like I went on this like 10-hour trip and I saw like unicorns and everything. But then you had the same friend who was like, I was completely sober, but then I had an episode where I saw like all these things. And I thought like whatever was speaking to me, I think the reception that you receive, even though it's from the same person and they had very similar kind of experiences, it's received in two very different ways. And I think the stigma from psychosis, that's where it stems from. Like people get nervous because they're like, oh my God, if you're not doing anything to like intentionally put yourself in that space, then like what if it happens to me? And like I've seen stories of people who are like high on bath salts and just like ripping off another person's face. Like what if that happens to you and you're having a psychotic episode? What if that happens to me? And it's stuff that I've struggled with myself. Like never did I ever think, I would go through something like that. And for a very long time, it was very hard for me to come to terms with it. But I think just in terms of the relationship, like it's there, but it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. Like I still don't know if my episode was exacerbated by, if it was like purely caused by my abuse of cannabis and other substances, or if it merely just exacerbated kind of what was already underlying, like the mental health stuff that I was struggling with beforehand. Yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the idea of complexity is really important, and I like what you brought forward about the idea of like a consensual experience as well. Like with hallucinogens, if you like take 3 tabs of acid, then you're essentially like consenting to have that however long trip and see whatever and have those experiences. But with psychosis, it's not like people ask for it. It's not like someone's like, oh, I'm gonna go have an episode of psychosis today. It's more of like something that's put on you, and it's like you can't really control it. It's very like all encompassing. And even if you have like a similar experience, that idea of the stigma is different because like people do see like those different experiences as completely different. Thank you. Harrison, did you want to add anything to that?
I didn't have much. I just wanted to second what was being said by Sarah about the like consensual opting in and like how that really changes how the experience is framed, and just seconding how like the same person could like relay the same basic, like a very similar experience on either side, but the consent makes it positive and negative in a way. And it's a big question of knowing what you're in for and having a good understanding of what you're in for before, strolling on in, so to speak. And I mean, for that reason, I think it wasn't explicitly asked, but in terms of like polysubstance use, like the line, you're just walking a trail you can't really see. There's a lot of brush and can't really, there's way less literature on like a mixture of substances than there is on like, say taking anything on its own. Yeah. And then also I will add what also wasn't directly mentioned, but if you're consuming any of these things, or I mean, what I'm just trying to get at is like how medication can have a similar effect on blurring the line of, are things okay? Are they not? Like if you're trying out medications, it's probably not the best time to be experimenting with marijuana, just as a general rule of thumb, at least until things like stabilize and you've gotten used to the brain chemistry of that medication, in my personal experience.
Thank you, Harrison. And I think the idea that like once you add all these different things into the mix, like it becomes hard to kind of tease out what is doing what is really important. And the point you bring up with medication, like the idea that you won't necessarily know how well the medication's working unless you do things like one step at a time, is really important because I had a lot of experiences trying to figure out like where I stood with my medication, and it took me like quitting substance use and like focusing on like just taking medication and getting into a better spot that I started to realize that things were working and things were like a little more even keel. Um, and yeah, I wanted to tell everyone again that if you have more questions, please throw them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Up next, we have a question from Sarah. So curious what your current relationship with cannabis is. Do you stop using completely? If so, what led you to this decision? So no pressure to answer on the stream, but I'd said I quit smoking cannabis, and it was because my perceptions were different. My like experiences with it were different, and it wasn't helping anymore. And it took a while to realize that. But yeah, anyone want to talk about theirs?
Yeah. Or sorry.
Go ahead, Sarah. I'll go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I've also pretty much stopped using cannabis completely. For a little while, maybe up to like a year after I got out of the hospital, I was discharged. I was still kind of smoking here and there. But like Elias said, like, for the first maybe half an hour, it would be fine. Like I would feel, relaxed. I could, sit down, enjoy a TV show or food. Cannabis, TV, and food is kind of like the trifecta of, like, for me, that's just the three always go hand in hand. But yeah, like eventually it would get to the point where, an hour into, by the time I was an hour into it, I would just be stuck with like deep depression, deep anxiety, paranoia, and it would be very akin to what I was feeling leading up to like my episode. So that was just like a hard no for me. But I have friends, I have people in my life who do use cannabis quite regularly. It's not a problem for me, and they are also very respectful. If there is a time when I request that they don't consume any in front of me, they're totally fine with it. But yeah, for me, it was just wasn't providing the same release in a positive way that I used to experience.
Thanks, Sarah. The idea that it takes a bit of time after like an episode really resonates with me because it did take me like a solid year to sort out like that, like it wasn't really working anymore and I was having all these negatives associated with it. So I think that's a really solid point too, because sometimes it does take time to reevaluate that relationship and to figure out like how this experience changes things in the future. Heath, you had something you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, I mean, immediately after psychosis, well, because when the onset of psychosis began, I was like, I need to stop doing drugs, right? So I like kind of quit cold turkey. But then I think because I was using cannabis so heavily, that like jarring switch only like aggravated the situation. Like I was almost having like a physical withdrawal from it, which I mean, if you're a regular cannabis user and then you try to stop, you might, have trouble sleeping because you're used to using it, and that kind of thing. So immediately after I got out of hospital and I was on medication, I was like, I'm over weed. Weed is not for me. That's quite a drug. And then like a week later, I was like, nah, I'm still smoking weed. I had a cannabis use disorder. Like I for a little bit, very briefly, was like, nah, like I'm not gonna smoke weed anymore. But then was like right back into my old habits using weed. but was managing it. I was seeing an addictions counselor, and we were talking specifically about edibles because I was making a lot of edibles for my friends at the time that like didn't want to smoke, and that's just like way more potent, and like carries a higher psychosis risk as well doing like edible products. But and so I've had like an on and off relationship with cannabis up until it's sober October. So I've opted. I'm not smoking weed this month. I guess I've decided. So I haven't smoked weed this month, and it's been actually really nice. My dreams are like a little too vivid, frankly, but it's fine, I guess. For the most part, it's nice to take a break. But when I am smoking weed or like using cannabis, I do not want to smoke anything like high THC. If it doesn't have CBD in it, I'm kind of not into it. Which could sound super pretentious. Someone's offering me weed, and I'm like, "What kind of weed is this?" But it's just because I don't want to freak out. Like and I can't smoke weed by myself either, which is it's kind of sad because I used to love that feeling of like relaxing on my own. But now I get freaked, man. Like I can do it socially with friends, but I can't really do it on my own these days. So maybe that's a blessing in disguise. So I don't know.
I think that's really good harm reduction messaging because like the idea that it is kind of like a fluid thing throughout people's lives and like having like a cannabis use disorder means that it like that relationship is even more complicated and that like you may use more or less at different points in your life, but sometimes it's just like a constant for a while and being able to recognize like what strains you can use, what the THC and CBD content you need. You said using socially, which is always a good harm reduction message. Like it's being able to take all these things into awareness. And like if quitting weed isn't something that's feasible like at the moment, then being able to bring in some of these different tools to evaluate that relationship and make sure that it's still healthy, right?
Definitely. And I've been bringing in like harm reduction techniques from like outside of the cannabis sphere. Like I've been applying honestly sometimes like psychedelic harm reduction techniques to my cannabis use, which is like set and setting is a huge thing for people in the psychedelic community. Like what is the setting you're in? What's your mindset? And like if I'm not in a good mindset or if I'm in a setting that's like I don't feel confident or comfortable using cannabis, then I'm just gonna opt out probably. And it's fine.
Mm-hmm. It is. Thanks, Heath. Harrison, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think Heath kind of like hit the nail on the head with I think some of the attitudes I have towards like cannabis, at least in terms of like I have an ongoing relationship with cannabis, but I try to think of it in pretty abstract terms, but like in terms of how I rationalize what is too much to myself, and like the topic of escape is like very like I'm like protecting that concept like heavily in the sense of if I feel like I'm like before I would smoke hypothetically I would think like what is it that I would be escaping from, and if like answers flood to my head there's a problem and I probably shouldn't, and that's like kind of a quick check. Like you can do it in like 5 seconds. If you go 5 seconds you're like, oh, everything's fine, but you do have to like intentionally stop and like not be moving and like just take a deep breath, do a like psychological inventory so to speak on like how you're like where your headspace is at, and like honestly like more often than not I'll like opt to just like take a step outside and walk through a trail and catch a breath of fresh air, because what I realized in those 5 seconds is that 5 seconds is what I needed, just stopping, checking in with myself and making sure I'm doing all right. And I think weed can easily become a substitute for that. It can fill the void where you can be very introspective, like the time you can spend thinking about how you're doing. It can take your mind off that, which is in part like the piece that's helpful about it to some people, but can easily become problematic, in my opinion.
I like the idea of like that check-in, that awareness before using of like what is the rationale for using? Am I trying to escape from something? Because that can be a problem. You touched on it earlier with like the phone analogy. Like if you're constantly going to your phone, then it becomes like a learned behavior. and then you don't even question doing it, just becomes a habit. And if that starts to become harmful, you might not even notice if you don't take those 5 seconds to be like, why am I using it right now?
I
Thank
love
you.
this. If I want to chime in and add something to that, which is that when I am using cannabis, I've made this switch to joints for this exact reason, because I have to take the time to roll a joint, and while I'm like mindful, I'm like practice, I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, why am I? What do I want out of this? Like, and it sounds so silly, but that's why it's like I can't have a bong. Because a bong, you wake up and there's a half a bowl packed from the night before, and you're like, okay, well, I guess I'll smoke weed, and it's like, no, you just having like mind like and barriers, like putting a on my phone the connection, like putting a timer so my apps turn off, so then I have to do that check where I'm like, do I want to look at Instagram? Same with like having something that isn't like a bong or a pipe that like is packed before I know it. It's like, this is like a small barrier, but it's a cannabis harm reduction for me, honestly. So
Just to add to that, I feel like you can't have something that's ready to go before you are. Like that's
no.
an accident waiting to happen. And like, at least for like people like myself, like in my position, like I can't have that accessibility. Like I need to separate myself from it physically.
Yeah, and it's like I've had a bong since, and every time I'm like, what have I got myself into? And then as soon as it breaks, I'm like, oh, I'm free.
The curse is lifted.
Yes.
I really like that. You can't have something that's ready before you are, because like then that moment is just kind of gone where you don't question it. It's just like good to go. Awesome. So once again, I'll mention to everyone watching that if you have more questions, throw them in the chat. We'll try and get to them. We have a comment from Kathy. Our first harm reduction site in Saskatoon just opened. I hope people learn to stop condemning the fact that it exists and they're letting people do drugs. It's not so much a question; it's just something that I thought was important to bring up especially because Heath is wearing that Insight shirt. So we have a question from Joanne. So each human has a unique ECS.
Endocannabinoid system, probably.
Nice, probably. And we'll experience different psychosis. Do you explain details to the youth about ECS and how our systems work? Also, discussions, interactions with pharma meds and cannabis that some adolescents might be prescribed. So I can speak for me personally and uh, say that like the knowledge of the endocannabinoid system is like outside of my spheres of expertise. But it is important to recognize that like is different for everyone, and people have different systems. And I'm venturing a little bit out of my realm of expertise here, but I did a presentation with this psychiatrist called Dr. Archie, and she would do talks about cannabis and psychosis, and she mentioned that people with schizophrenia actually have more endocannabinoid receptors in their like nervous system. So the relationship can be kind of two ways. It can like the your biology can feed into your actions, and I don't think it's as simple as either one or the other. Did anyone have anything they wanted to talk about with that? Maybe the interactions with pharmaceutical meds and cannabis that some adolescents might be prescribed. I know, Harrison, you touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, my thing was it was more it's hard to open the can of worms without getting to the bottom of it. But basically, I was prescribed a medication that like put me on like a drug induced psychosis, so to speak, and I was smoking weed at the time. And so the way I have taught myself to refer to like the situations as like a perfect storm. And I was doing probably a lot of things that weren't the best for me, and they all kind of just contributed, like each a unique factor to like how I would end up feeling, but they perpetuate the same issue, which was like this disconnection with how I was actually feeling, which is kind of why I've been reinforcing that check in a lot now. but like I was just blurring the lines in terms of, you know, my headspace and the connection with it, and letting myself smoke weed to like help with the symptoms of a new medication I was taking, when really like the symptoms were like insomnia and for like 4 nights straight. So on the fifth day I just broke, and that was psychosis. It started off nice and then went paranoid. So yeah, like, and then that was just an up and down roller coaster after that. But I mean, I hope that some piece of that could have spoke to how, you know, people process medications differently. Like if I was taking a prescription medication that a psychiatrist gave to me and said, this will help you with your depression, and I just took it, like I would expect that it would yield that result. But everyone has a different brain chemistry, and you have to be very sensitive with these things. And I think almost like prescription medication is so normalized that we almost expect things to just kind of just get better when we start taking them, as opposed to needing to take a close psychological inventory on yourself and think through your thought processes and, you know, reflect on your state. I think, because I'm just trying to relate, ultimately, like everyone's system is different, and by a doctor thinking that this medication was perfect for me, actually it was the exact opposite. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that like medications are, at the moment anyways, like an imperfect science. And we know that certain medications work for certain people, but not all medications work for everyone. And so it makes it really hard. And what you were talking about earlier about like adding in cannabis is just another like confounding factor. So it's harder to know like if that's like a good medication that's actually working, or if like the cannabis is having some sort of effect that's like counteracting the medication. And I don't think any of us are really super qualified to talk about like specific medications or anything like that. So if this is like an issue that you're running into, I would highly recommend talking more about it with your psychiatrist or your family doctor, whomever is prescribing, or whoever has that therapeutic relationship with you, because medications are a beast of their own. And like the yeah.
One thing I would just say is like you can, like I recommend, like everyone has a unique relationship with their psychiatrist or physician, whatever it may be, but pharmacists are like there for you, like just to like give you the thing and make sure you know what you're taking. They ask you when you pick up your stuff, like, have you taken this before, so that they can walk you through it. And they would be happy to answer questions, I'm sure, in a lot of cases on like interactions with cannabis. So I definitely do not feel comfortable mentioning, you know, specific interactions. I'm not like into pharma, that stuff. So yeah, but every person is different, and like, you know, drugs might interact with cannabis. And yeah, I just think that it's really important to I mean, they're a resource you can use, and if you're being prescribed medication, they're a necessary middleman. So definitely ask
Yeah.
about cannabis in that case. If you do
Yeah,
consume, I'd recommend asking every time.
I'm glad you brought that up, because like pharmacists are pretty undervalued like tools in people's lives, because they do know like so much about the medications that they're giving out. And yeah, they would definitely be a great resource to tap on.
I think it's also just, if I could just chime in quickly, because we've been talking a little bit about like polysubstance use and medications, and when talking about like drug harm reduction and like polysubstance use, like we there are big charts of like drug interactions, but it's mostly like illicit or party drugs, right? Because it's like sometimes people only recognize it as polysubstance use if they're like, oh, like I'm specifically mixing alcohol and weed, like I'm doing this intentionally. And if I had a dime every time I like was with a friend and I was like, oh, but what about like your medication? Like, have you looked into like how, isn't it a blood thinner? Like, have you thought about how that might like affect, like, should you take less of the drug then because you're on blood thinners? And they're always like, oh yeah, because it's just a part of their everyday, so they don't consider it like polysubstance use. But medication is drugs, and if you're on medication and using recreational drugs, like that's polysubstance use, like you're mixing drugs. So definitely something to be wary of.
Just say one more thing. Like this extends to even foods. Like if you take certain medications, there are some foods you can't eat. Like In some cases,
Grapefruit?
I know you can, like grapefruit. If you eat that, like it'll up the potency by like whatever. I'm not gonna talk numbers. It's not my specialty either. But like, if foods can like change the concentration of a drug in your system, what would another drug do? So I think
Yeah.
that's just a very good thing to think through in terms of like, I mean, if a food can do it, what would another set of chemicals do?
Yeah, and I think that kind of touches at one of the foundations of harm reduction, right? Is that knowledge and giving people the knowledge to make their own informed decisions. And without knowing that maybe someone is engaging in polysubstance abuse because they're taking a medication and taking like some other substance at the same time, being able to like have those resources like your family doctor, your psychiatrist, or your pharmacist to be able to walk you through like what the possible effects of that are. Because if food can do it, who knows what other drugs could do. Um, yeah, we got another question coming here from a parent of a 16-year-old who recently found a large bong and other paraphernalia in his room. What would you feel is the best approach for them to open up a conversation with him?
Ouch.
Yeah, I would love to speak on this one because my relationship with my parents and also their understanding of drugs is very interesting. I want to say, Steve, first of all, the fact that you're even like reaching out in this space is like an excellent first step. Speaking just personally with my parents, I come from an immigrant family from Taiwan, and like in many parts of Asia, like drugs, even things like marijuana, maybe to a lot of people is seen as just like, oh, it's like a recreational kind of thing. Like in Asia, it's like a hard no, like you would get serious jail time just for even having like a gram of weed. So that was the kind of understanding they had of substances coming to Canada. And the kind of like stereotypical like dazed and confused kind of like approach to marijuana to my parents, it's like they would equate marijuana to like shooting heroin. So they were very, very like very, very intense about it. And I think I hid my drug use, my experimentation from my parents, knowing full well that if they had found anything in my room, they would have like lost their minds. Honestly, we've never really had like a full conversation about it. I'm like pretty much in my like almost 30, and it's still something that I don't really feel comfortable talking to my parents about. I think as they've spent time in Canada, their approach to cannabis has changed, especially with like new legislation and so forth. But I think the most important thing, like for me, if I was to go back to being a 16-year-old and my parents had found a bong or some paraphernalia in my room, the last thing I want is for them to start like accusing me of things and start, pointing the finger and, start equating like my worth as a human to my drug use, because that would just completely achieve the opposite of what you want. Whether or not it ends in like a positive conversation, like your child will never ever open up to you again. Like that closes the door. At least for me, that closes the door forever. So in the future, if your child has questions, has concerns, if they need someone to reach out to because they need some help, I think it's very important to make sure that the door is always open. And yeah, I don't think, if you want to make it like a very kind of like easygoing kind of thing, you want to ease into this whole conversation, this whole space, maybe you don't have to start by saying like, hey, I found this in your room. Maybe you can be like, hey, like, I've been watching some stuff on TV. There's news going on around whatever. Like, what are your thoughts on these things? And that kind of gives you a good kind of idea of where your child stands. Because if your child is using very frequently, I think their answer would be a little telling just by the way they talk about it. Or maybe they're just like curious. Like maybe their friend gave them their bong, and like genuinely, maybe they're just holding on to it for a friend. But I think in this area. It's always good to kind of be there as like a pillar of like support and to let your child take the lead.
I think there's a lot of really good points there, and the idea that like being open to the conversation is really important, and not the finger wagging kind of like blaming type of conversation, but the conversation where you can like openly explore people's beliefs and like figure out what's going on, and like is he just holding the bong for someone else? Is he experimenting? Is he using recreationally? Is he like using a lot, like trying to figure out all these different things and being able to maintain that connection throughout so that the supports can still be there. And that can be like a connection that kind of withstands time and it doesn't kind of shut things down right off the bat. Heath, I saw you nodding your head a lot. Did you want to add something to that?
I can add. I'll try to keep it brief, but Sarah made a lot of good points. Definitely don't come off with a gotcha, accusatory, close that. Your child will not want to talk to you probably. I mean, it could depend, but like they might feel like their privacy's been invaded. Like, maybe especially if you haven't started the conversation. I love what Sarah said about like start the conversation not about them and their use. Make it about cannabis broadly, because that's less intimidating to approach probably for both of you. It'll be more comfortable to just be like, oh yeah, so like what's up with that? Or even just like saying like, hey, if you ever like were like wanted to try drugs, or if you ever had questions about drugs, you can come to me. Just invite them. Oh, just be inviting. Do not come at them. Like, just, yeah, because you want to invite them to share information. You don't want to force it out of them. Those are all, because yeah, I do not pity you, sir, for being in that situation, because I'm lucky because I mean, like, I don't have kids. I'm very young, but one of my cousins, I didn't like catch them smoking, but they caught me smoking at Christmas, and then that was my way to open the conversation. And I was like, yeah, it's a holiday. I'm an adult, but like, if you ever are like, you can come to me. And that was way more approachable for them because it was about me and my drug use, and it wasn't about them. And now they can like DM me on Instagram if they want to like ask questions, and they see the work that I do. So definitely like inviting the conversation, maybe separating them and their use out of it, and just being like, what do you think about this? And then just making sure that they make a safe space for them to share information with you. Because if they don't feel safe, if they feel like you're coming for them, then that probably won't go very well for either of you.
I think that idea of a safe space is really important. And I know the term is thrown around a lot nowadays, but at the same time, there's a reason for it. And for people to be able to have those conversations and open up and maintain those connections, like they need to be safe, they need to feel safe enough to be able to engage with it. And so being able to create that environment where you can talk about it, and maybe not even immediately about like the kid and the child like right then, or the teenager, but just open up the conversation to have those deeper conversations later on as well. Harrison, you seemed like you had something you wanted to say there too.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy situation because, I mean, like, you're coming from the approach of you kind of know something is happening to a degree, and like you want to like find out more about it without acting like you know this stuff about them, which is going to come off as intrusive. So I think like the best thing you can do, which has kind of already been said, is show them they can talk to you about cannabis without it being about them safely. So they'll kind of learn that they can talk to you about it with them. I mean, over time, they'll learn that they can talk to you about it safely, or you'll just set that precedent with them, so to speak. And I think that's something that's been difficult in my personal journey. Like, I definitely felt like, I'm trying to find a way to say this, but because like I wish my parents asked about like my relationship and why it was there, or like we're even curious, because I think that's the bottom line. What I've kind of been preaching today is like, be curious. Like, it's good to like be able to do these inventory checks on yourself and like wonder why this makes you feel this way and all that stuff. But I think like the big issue for me is like I found that talking about these things with my parents was a trigger point for them, and they couldn't talk about it without escalating in a way. And so and like as a conflict avoidant kid, who just wanted to like keep the peace in the way, I thought it would be best to not go to them about this because they couldn't bring it up without being calm, and it was kind of why I was smoking weed. I wanted to be calm. So like, but yeah, like at the risk of oversimplifying it, that was kind of the case. But yeah, I just think you want to like keep that door open. I mean, ultimately, what I'm sure is the case for you is you're most concerned with your kid's safety, and then secondary to that is your relationship with them. So make that, like, say that you can do that. Like, I'm most concerned with, you know, the well-being of our family, but also like the fact that you're happy, like comfortable, and like if there's something going on, I want to know about it. And cannabis is a slippery slope. It can be. And the truth is, like, if there's a bong, that it somewhat can imply like regular use, but you definitely want to be curious. I would just say, yeah, like, be curious so that they can learn that attitude about it. Because if you fear drugs to them, like, it'll, like, that fear will manifest in a weird way in their life, whether it's in your relationship with them or their relationship with drugs. Who knows? It's messy, but you can control it. Like, I think I'm just big for like stating motives from the get-go and saying, like, open, transparent communication, you know? I think that's how you
I
build
think
trust,
that
bro.
mhm. I think that idea of curiosity is really important because, like you mentioned like a slippery slope, and like there are people who progress from cannabis into other substance use, and at the same time there are people who use cannabis and kind of like stay there. People who use cannabis a couple times and just leave it be, and like the only way to kind of figure out where that's going and to maintain that connection is to have those conversations about it, and to be open and create that safe space and figure out what the motives are. And a lot of what we've talked about today, just being able to apply that and like have those conversations and figure out what's going on, because there is a certain amount of normalcy to experimentation, especially I think they said they're 16 years old. I know when I was 16, I was experimenting with all sorts of stuff, and like not everyone goes into like the problematic route, and some people it can be helpful for them, at least for a time. And no worries, Steve.
I would love to also quickly shamelessly plug CSSTP's Sensible Cannabis Education Toolkit, because this was like something we put together, like young people put together for like teachers, adults, parents generally, to have more like to this conversation, because it's not easy. It's easier if you've prepped by like talking about cannabis, like we had mentioned, like talking about, oh, this is legal now, or something that's common in like drug forums, which if your kid's using drugs and maybe curious about drugs might find themselves on sometimes, is the whole like swim. Someone who isn't me, it's like navigating, you're like, I'm not doing anything sketchy. So it's like, even if you're like, oh yeah, like my friend took an edible and I was so surprised to see how it affected them. I don't know, like, because then I don't know, because maybe you're not using cannabis and you can't relate it back to yourself to relate to your kid, but I don't know, just thinking about like ways to kind of, if the first conversation you have about weed with your kid is about them using weed, you should have started talking about weed way earlier with them, basically. This is my thought.
Sorry. At the same time, it's never too late. So being able to
No,
have those conversations, even if it might have been helpful to have them earlier, having them now is a good time too. Because
definitely.
there's a saying I really like. It's like the best time to have planted a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. Uh, yeah. So we're getting a few more questions, but we're coming up on the hours. So maybe if we do this again, we'll be able to get to them. But I want to give everyone a chance to kind of give some final thoughts. Just maybe a takeaway message that you want, or something that you feel is important about we talked about today, just to reiterate. Does anyone want to start us off with that?
I guess I'll say something. I know this is more geared towards like youth perspective on cannabis psychosis, but I'm really happy to see there are parents out there who are approaching this from like a place of like true concern. Just seeing how attitudes towards cannabis, especially among the youth and like use around cannabis, has evolved over the last couple of years has been really, really encouraging. And it all kind of ties back to like what like this series is just one small part of like what a lot of advocates are doing. They're doing great work in terms of trying to have these educated conversations where it's not just like drugs equal bad and cannabis is a drug and therefore it's bad. It's way more nuanced than that. Every single person's different. I think we touched on all of those topics today, and I'm really glad that people are continuing to engage with it.
Thank you, Sarah. Heath or Harrison, do you want to put some final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think my whole thing, I realized like halfway through this talk, almost ironically, like my whole thing I've been saying this whole time is explore the link, like in your head, like your own personal relationship, but it is worth exploring and like understanding well if it's something you're going to engage with. And so I think, yeah, just understanding as well, like, just general triggers and things that, that's more specific to psychosis, but like general things that like are stressful for you so that you're not using in times where these are very present in your life. Just cannabis blurs the line. It makes the link harder to explore, so to speak, if you're in it. So yeah, just being curious and exploring these things with an open mind.
Awesome. Thanks, Harrison. Heath, do you have a final thought?
Final thoughts. These conversations go so fast. I'm like, it's been an hour. I feel like we talked for like 5 minutes. But yeah, just the importance of the conversation. Like starting the conversation about substances and drugs like early enough with like age appropriate content, and same with mental health. And like I think we often approach these together because they are linked, but they also exist on their own. Like some people use drugs absent of mental health like circumstances, and some people experience mental illness absent of substance use, but then they still tend to intersect. But just like having these conversations doing wonders, because people get uncomfortable when it comes to psychosis. Every time I post about psychosis related stuff on Instagram, someone unfollows me because they don't want to be confronted with the reality, and they're like, we get it, you're like the mental illness thing, but it's like, it's important. And it's like, I wish I had seen more positive and hopeful messaging around substance use and mental illness as a young person, because it was always like, if you use drugs, you're going to ruin your life. And it's like, I'm already mentally ill. Like, what else you got for me? Kind of like, can we maybe like change up the approach a little bit? So yeah, just love having these conversations. Love, especially with like 4 other people. Like, love you folks. This has been so good. Happy to do this. Yeah, it's been good. Start the conversations, keep the conversations going, and do it in a way that, centers lived experience, centers evidence, is riddled with harm reduction throughout, and is non-judgmental and just like non-stigmatizing, and just baseline, it's okay to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Heath. And that brings us to the end of today. I've really enjoyed this too, echoing what everyone's already talked about. And I feel privileged to be able to like help host these conversations. And just to everyone watching, thank you for joining us. We have a survey in the comments for you to fill out. Let us know how we did. If there's any other questions that you have, we love your feedback, and we can kind of like tailor the future ones we do to what you're all thinking. Kind of wanted to plug the website, so cannabispsychosis.ca. We have an amazing FAQ on there, and it talks about cannabis, psychosis, mental health, all that sort of stuff. And we also have a good resource section, because I saw someone was hoping for a bit more of that. Check us out on socials too, because we post a lot to all social media, and we come up with like new research, and we help spread that and just get the word out. So thank you all for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Bye.